My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 36 years old, and I work as a corporate legal strategist based in New York. Most days I deal with mergers, loopholes, and long-winded contracts. But nothing in my career, no boardroom negotiation, no hostile acquisition prepared me for the day I stood in a courtroom, across from my own parents. The room was silent when my lawyer stood up. Calm, steady, certain. "Your Honor," she said, "we'd like to present the final piece of evidence, what the decedent herself referred to as the blue box." All eyes turned to me. I reached into my leather satchel and placed the small metal box on the table. It was no bigger than a book, scratched at the corners, worn at the hinge. But inside that box was the truth that could unravel decades of manipulation. Across the courtroom, my mother Margot stiffened. My father Charles looked like someone had kicked the air out of his lungs. And in that moment, everything slowed until my voice broke through the stillness. I was told I wasn't their daughter. I was told I'd get nothing when they died. But my grandmother's lawyer said otherwise. He said the money, $2.5 million, was mine. And he had proof that they lied. That line, that lie. "You're not our daughter, you'll get nothing." My mother spat those words at me when I was 11 years old. I had broken something perfume, I think. And in front of polished furniture and fake smiles, she threw that truth at me like it was fact. "You were adopted. We never wanted you." It became the background noise of my entire adolescence. But the lie didn't end there. Over the years, it grew roots. It turned into refusals to support my college plans. It disguised itself as lectures about tough love and independence. And behind the scenes, my parents were preparing to sell off my grandmother's house, her legacy, like it was theirs to give. They thought they had buried every trace of truth beneath forged documents, rewritten narratives, and cold inheritance calculations. But my grandmother didn't believe in silence. She believed in records. And she believed in me. As I opened the blue box in front of the court, my hands didn't shake. Inside were the copies of financial documents, DNA reports, letters, notarized signatures, and one handwritten statement from my grandmother, Helen Cartwright. The judge motioned for a recess. My mother whispered furiously into her lawyer's ear. My father tried to avoid my eyes. But it was too late. There it was proof that I was her granddaughter, that the trust fund was mine, that my parents had lied and tried to steal what was never theirs to begin with. You want to know how we got here? I'll tell you. But let me take you back to the night before all of this, to the moment everything clicked into place. It was raining in Brooklyn the night before the trial, the kind of slow, steady drizzle that seeps into your bones if you stay out too long. I sat in my apartment alone, the heat on low with only the yellow glow of a desk lamp keeping me company. The box sat in front of me. I had found it weeks ago inside my grandmother's sewing table, hidden in a false panel, the same table she used to sit at Humming Billie Holiday while patching quilts or fixing buttons. The blue box had her handwriting on a note taped to the lid. "Claire, you'll know when it's time." And I did. That night, I finally opened the last envelope she left inside, sealed thick and marked in black ink. "Read only if they challenge you." The letter was simple, honest, heavy. "My darling girl, if they try to take what belongs to you, let this speak for me." I saw what they did. I knew they'd do it again. That's why I left this trail. For you, with love always. Grandma, I didn't cry. I just sat back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. I thought of the years I spent wondering why love from them always came with a condition. I thought about how I'd made myself smaller, just to fit in their narrow version of what a daughter should be. I thought about how quiet my grandmother had gone in her final days, not out of weakness, but because she was preparing this. At 1:17 a.m., I stood up, went to the kitchen, and made tea with the last of the mint leaves she'd given me the summer before she passed. And I said to myself aloud with absolute clarity, tomorrow I will hold that box up in court, and I won't flinch. because sometimes justice doesn't come in gavel strikes or dramatic confessions. Sometimes it comes in the form of a quiet woman, holding a small blue box full of inconvenient truths. We lived in a 3-story colonial home just outside Charleston. From the street, it was perfect fresh white paint, symmetrical hedges, flagstone walkway, and a pristine BMW always parked in the circular driveway. My mother insisted on keeping it there rather than in the garage. She said it completed the composition. That's how she talked, like everything was a performance piece. "You never know who's driving by Claire," she'd remind me. "Appearances are investments." Inside, though, the house was cold, and not just in temperature. The kitchen tile had cracks that grew longer each season. The refrigerator clicked like it was trying to breathe through asthma. The air conditioning broke every summer, but instead of fixing it, my father said, "Just open a window." We're not running a resort, but we were running a resort of sorts, at least to the outside world. Every weekend, my mother hosted something: brunches, teas, charity drives with linen napkins and finger sandwiches. She always wore pearls, always reapplied lipstick between conversations. At church, people called her the Charleston Rose. But at home, I was the weed in her perfect garden. She never yelled, not loudly at least. Her sharpness was quiet, clinical. If I ever disagreed, she'd pause, tilt her head, and say, "Claire, you're starting to sound very ungrateful." Gratitude became a requirement for love. She reminded me often how much trouble I was, how expensive ballet classes had been when I quit after 3 weeks, how my braces were an investment that didn't yield a return, how I couldn't even look like them properly. My hair was darker, my skin a shade more olive, my voice deeper. She called them unfortunate features. She never explicitly said I didn't belong, but she made sure I always felt like a guest who overstayed her welcome. One summer when I was 9, I asked for new school shoes. My toes had started to curl under from the tightness. She looked at me, sighed dramatically, and said, "Claire, do you think money grows on trees? You're always needing, always taking." But that same afternoon, a package arrived: 2 new dresses from Neiman Marcus. Not for me, of course. For her next garden party. Tags still attached. Even my father Charles, who was softer in manner, carried the same underlying tone. He talked about discipline, about financial priorities, about how I needed to understand the value of things. "You want new shoes," he said once. "Pick up leaves in the yard for a week. You'll learn." I did pick up the leaves. He forgot to buy the shoes. I learned, though. I learned that love in our household had a ledger, a balance sheet. You were either an asset or a liability. And somehow I was always in the red. The word daughter was used rarely, never in affection, always in obligation. I was the one they introduced with polite nods, the one they corrected in public with fake smiles and clenched teeth. "Not that story, Claire. Sit straighter, dear. Why must you always make things awkward?" I used to think that maybe if I could be perfect, if I just said the right things, wore the right clothes, never asked for anything, they might soften. They might change. But they never did. Because the truth was, they didn't see me as their child. They saw me as part of the furniture, useful for appearances, unwanted in reality. Years later, standing in that courtroom, I looked into their faces and finally understood. I was never meant to inherit anything, not just money, but warmth, security, or love. They weren't a family, they were a brand, and I had never been part of their product line. If my parents' house was a museum, cold curated and painfully silent, then my grandmother's home in Peoria, Illinois, was a warm, cluttered sanctuary where I could finally exhale. I spent every summer there from the time I was 7 until I left for college. 2 months each year where I could stop pretending, where I could be a kid. The first time I stepped through her door, I noticed the smell: vanilla nutmeg and old books. It's a scent I still associate with safety. Her kitchen always had something: baking lemon bars, snickerdoodles peach cobbler. The curtains were hand-stitched, embroidered with little wildflowers. Nothing matched and nothing needed to. She had a way of making the ordinary feel sacred. She didn't rush. She didn't correct me mid-sentence. She listened. During my first summer with her, I asked if I could help decorate the dining table before dinner. She lit up and said, "Then you'll need to learn how to place flowers." She showed me how to trim stems at an angle, how to balance height and color, how to choose a vessel that didn't overwhelm the blooms. That lesson turned into a ritual. Every summer, every dinner, a small bouquet, sometimes store-bought, often wildflowers, from the edge of her yard sat between us as we ate. And the food. She didn't just cook, she taught. She believed that every girl should know how to make a flaky crust and whip cream by hand. She called it insurance for the soul. There was something healing in the way she folded butter into dough or taught me how to test jam with a cold spoon. But the thing I remember most, more than the pies, more than the flowers, was how she taught me to write letters. She kept a drawer full of stationery, thick parchment, tiny floral cards, envelopes in pastel tones. She made me choose a different set every week and sit at her kitchen table to write to someone who matters. Sometimes I wrote to her, sometimes to myself. She said writing was how we make meaning of the mess. One day I asked her why she lived alone. Why didn't she ever visit Charleston? She was folding napkins at the time. Her hands stilled and she looked me in the eyes. "There are two kinds of families, Claire," she said quietly. "The kind that protects you, and the kind you have to survive." I didn't fully understand then. I just nodded and reached for another napkin. As I got older, our conversations deepened. She talked about her late husband, my grandfather, how they built a business from nothing, how it was sold after his death, how the money was supposed to sustain the family. But she always grew vague when I asked where the money went. I've made arrangements, she'd say, changing the subject to my art or my grades. Still, she dropped clues. She taught me about budgeting before I even had a bank account. She showed me how to read contracts and recognize manipulative language. At the time, I thought she was just eccentric. Now I realize she was preparing me. Each time I returned to Charleston after the summer, I felt like I was leaving color for grayscale. My mother would inspect my suitcase like I was smuggling in bad habits. "You smell like cinnamon," she said once, wrinkling her nose. It wasn't an insult. It was a souvenir. Evaha. I used to cry the night before leaving Peoria. My grandmother always noticed even when I tried to hide it. She never said, "Don't be sad." She just held me longer, tucked handwritten notes into my bag and whispered, "You don't owe anyone your silence, Claire. Not even your parents." And for a long time, those notes were all I had until the blue box surfaced and changed everything. By the time I turned 16, I had stopped asking questions. It wasn't just the coldness of the house or the way my mother inspected my outfits like she was choosing wallpaper, disappointed no matter the pattern. It was the coded language, the tension that hummed beneath every dinner conversation. The way my parents, Margot and Charles Bennett, spoke about money like it was a ghost felt but never fully seen. They never said the word broke. They used phrases like the market shifted or our portfolio took a hit. At first, I thought it was just adult stuff, mysterious and above me. But over time, I realized it wasn't that they didn't want me to understand. It was that they didn't want me to know. One evening, I overheard my father on the phone. His voice was low, clipped, like he was trying to keep it together. "Tell them we're restructuring. We'll delay the wire until Friday." "No, I don't care what their legal department says, stall." When he saw me in the hallway, he ended the call abruptly. "Listening in is a bad habit," he said, without looking at me. I wanted to say I wasn't. I wanted to say I was just walking to the kitchen. But I didn't. I'd learned by then that speaking up only gave them more to use against me. At dinner that night, the silence was brittle. Then my mother sighed long and performative. She stared at her wine glass like it had betrayed her. "Claire, you think money just appears, don't you?" I blinked. "No." She cut me off with a scoff. "You think we live like this because we're lucky, because someone handed it to us." Charles was staring at his plate. He didn't intervene. Then she leaned forward, her eyes sharp. "Let me tell you something. No one gives you anything. Every dollar you think we have is chained to something. to someone. That's how the world works. I didn't understand it fully then, but I understood enough I was not part of their plan. They took calls at strange hours. They whispered names I didn't recognize. Once I saw a letter from a bank in the Cayman Islands. My mother burned it in the fireplace before I could read more than the logo. The cars stayed shiny. The garden remained manicured. But cracks were forming in voices and glances in the way the help stopped showing up as often. Margot started visiting friends in Atlanta more frequently. Charles spent more time at the club, which he never actually enjoyed. They were escaping each other and the illusion they built. Meanwhile, I faded into the wallpaper. I started keeping a journal. Not because I had anything particularly poetic to say, but because I needed to record how their masks slipped, how their lies tangled together. I didn't know why yet, but I felt like one day I might need proof, or memory, or both. I still remember the night I found the envelope tucked inside my mother's closet. It wasn't addressed to anyone. No name. Just a symbol, a crest I didn't recognize. I didn't take it, I didn't open it. But from that day on, I knew something deeper was buried. They kept saying phrases like liquidation phase offshore hold and asset freeze. I wrote them down phonetically, then looked them up in the library after school. What kind of parents talk like this with their teenage daughter in the room? Not parents. Business partners playing house. I wasn't their daughter. I was an inconvenience, a risk, maybe even a liability. And still, I stayed. I played the role. Until the summer, everything unraveled and the blue box came into my hands. I was 11 the day I dropped the perfume bottle. It slipped from my fingers like time silent for a breath, then shattering across the marble floor. The sharp, sweet smell of rose and bergamot filled the air. It was Margot's favorite bottle, something French and expensive. I remember the label had gold lettering, the kind that shimmered under light. It had been a gift from a board member's wife. Or maybe a bribe. With my mother, the line was thin. The sound brought her instantly. She appeared in the doorway, heels clicking like gunshots. I turned to face her frozen hands still in the air, as if I could rewind time by holding the shape of the mistake. Her eyes went to the floor, then to my face. And then she said it. "You're not my daughter." Just like that. Her voice wasn't raised. No shouting, no dramatics. She said it the way someone might mention the weather. "You're not my daughter." The words hung in the air, longer than the scent of broken perfume. I didn't cry. Not then. My hands shook, my ears rang. I felt like I was sinking beneath the surface of something thick and invisible. And she just walked away, leaving the pieces of glass and me on the floor. I swept them up in silence, every shard cut deeper than the last. For months after, she never mentioned it again. But she didn't need to. She had planted it. A sentence like that doesn't fade. It loops, echoes, becomes a background hum, like an off-key note that never ends. I'd sit at dinner while they talked about stocks or travel or charity galas, and all I'd hear was, "You're not my daughter." Every birthday card signed Margot, not Mom. Every family photo with me slightly off to the side. Every time she introduced me to a guest as Claire, she lives with us like I was some sort of tenant. One time, I asked my father if it was true. We were in his study, a cold room with leather chairs that no one actually used. I stood in the doorway, knees shaking. "Am I adopted?" He didn't look up from his newspaper. "Don't be ridiculous." That was it. That was the whole conversation. But a week later, I noticed the locks on the filing cabinets had been changed. Documents vanished from drawers that used to stay open. Even my baby pictures seemed to shift, fewer in the hallway, more of just Margot and Charles at charity events. I started questioning everything. My last name, my birth certificate, the way people looked at me during fundraisers when my parents weren't around. Was I their daughter or just someone who filled the role, and yet they never fully disowned me? Not legally, not in public. I was convenient until I wasn't. Useful when appearances were needed, silent when truth tried to surface. But that sentence, that one moment of fracture, never left. You're not my daughter." I began to write it down, over and over in the margins of my notebooks. Not to dwell on it, but to remember it clearly, to make sure it wasn't softened or forgotten. Because the older I got, the more I understood it wasn't just a moment of anger. It was a declaration, a warning, a truth they meant to bury but let slip too soon. And I was the one who would dig it back up. At 18, I got into Columbia. Not just got and earned a full scholarship for a double major in law and financial economics. I remember sitting in my bedroom holding the letter in my hands, reading it 3 times just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. My heart was pounding. I laughed alone. It was the kind of laugh that bursts out when you've worked in silence for years, and finally someone out there says, "Yes, we see you." I walked downstairs, clutching the envelope, the Columbia crest shining in blue and silver. For a moment I imagined the look on Margot's face. Pride, surprise, maybe even the tiniest glimmer of affection. She was in the kitchen arranging cut orchids into a vase that already looked full. "Mom," I said. "I got it. Columbia. Full ride." She didn't turn around, just kept adjusting the flowers like I'd told her I'd won a raffle at the grocery store. After a beat, she said, "And what exactly do you think you'll do with that?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" She turned to face me, then eyes lined perfectly in charcoal gray. "Law and finance." "That's your plan. That's how you intend to survive." I stood frozen in the doorway, the letter starting to crumple in my hand. "Who do you think you are, Claire?" she continued, voice like ice slipping under the skin. "Do you think the world hands out success to little girls with scholarships? People like us survive by playing the game, not reading the rulebook." I wanted to shout back that I'd read every rule, that I'd dissected contracts for fun-studied case law while other kids partied, that I didn't want their money or their charity, just one moment of acknowledgement. But I said nothing. I folded the letter and slid it back into its envelope. From that day forward, our relationship became a performance. She played the elegant socialite mother. I played the quiet, independent daughter. At functions, she introduced me as Claire, our little lawyer in training with a brittle smile that cracked when no one was watching. At home, it was different. The air between us buzzed with words unsaid. If I brought up a grade, she'd change the subject. If I mentioned an internship, she'd scoff. "Real jobs don't pay in idealism," she said once, waving away my excitement like smoke. But it wasn't just the dismissals, it was the absence. No calls during finals, no good luck texts before interviews, no celebration when I got into Columbia Law for my JD. Just silence like my achievements only existed in a world parallel to hers, and she refused to visit. The space between us grew quieter, colder. I started keeping track of things she never said. "I'm proud of you." "That's amazing. You did it." I began to understand that some mothers nurture with love. Mine nurtured with scarcity. She rationed affection like it was wartime, and I wasn't on the list for supplies. When I moved out, she didn't ask for my address. When I started my first job, she didn't ask where. She'd become an echo there, but not there, fading even when she stood in front of me. And yet, some part of me still hoped that one day I'd show her a courtroom win or a headline with my name and she'd finally say it. But I was old enough now to know the truth: some people don't change. And some relationships, no matter how many degrees you earn or how many trials you win, stay fractured at the root. She didn't want a daughter. She wanted control. And the moment I stopped needing her, she stopped pretending. It had been 3 weeks since I'd last spoken to my mother. Not that we'd had a real conversation in years, just strained calls during holidays, mostly out of obligation. But 3 weeks of silence wasn't unusual between us. What was unusual was the text. 3 words. No greeting, no punctuation. "She's dead." That was it. No grandma passed away peacefully. No "I thought you should know," not even Helen. Just, "She's dead." I stared at the message, read it again and again. I was in my office when it came through, papers, stacked email, buzzing, a cup of cold coffee beside me. For a moment, the world narrowed into the glowing screen of my phone. I didn't cry. Not then. I didn't reply either. What was I supposed to say? I'm sorry. How did she die? Are you okay? None of it would have mattered. Margot didn't text for connection. She texted to control the narrative to let me know she'd moved on without me. And she had. There was no funeral invite, no obituary I could find, no photos, no slideshow, no celebration of Helen's life. Just a message as flat and cold as the relationship that sent it. I sat in silence for a long time. Then I went home. And I wept. Not the kind of crying you do when someone dies, but the kind you do when a thread you've been holding for years finally snaps. Helen wasn't just my grandmother. She was my compass. When the house in Charleston became too quiet, too heavy with things unsaid, she was the one who wrote letters, who sent care packages to my dorm filled with homemade cookies, old paperback novels, and lavender sachets. She was the one who told me, "You are not them, Claire." And thank God for that. Her death didn't feel like the end of a life. It felt like the loss of my only safe witness. The only person who saw me truly saw me before I became ungrateful, cold, or difficult. Still, I kept going. I returned to work, buried myself in client files, and let grief settle into the quiet corners of my life. Until the phone rang. It was late past 9. I almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar area code 3112 Chicago. A voice came through, calm, professional, but not cold. "Miss Claire Bennett. Yes, my name is Douglas Weir. I was your grandmother Helen's attorney. I've been trying to reach you." I sat up straighter. "You're calling about her will?" "Yes, exactly. Mrs. Helen Prescott left specific instructions regarding the distribution of her estate. I'll need to speak with you directly. In person, if possible." I blinked. Did she leave something for me? There was a pause. Then he said, "She left everything, Miss Bennett, but she also left a box and a letter." I didn't speak. My throat was tight. "She said you would understand what to do with them when the time was right." Another pause. Then he added, "I can be in Charleston by Friday. Shall we arrange a meeting?" "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, please." When I hung up, my heart was thudding. A box. A letter. And everything. I looked over at my bookshelf where Helen's last note still sat, unopened, the envelope thick and sealed. She'd mailed it the month before she died. The handwriting was unmistakable. In that moment, I knew my mother's silence hadn't erased the truth. It had only delayed it. And that box, it would change everything. When I arrived at the law office, everything felt too quiet. It was on the 3rd floor of a weathered brick building in downtown Charleston. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. I stepped inside, and the receptionist gave me a polite nod before ushering me into a paneled room that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1980s. Heavy drapes, leather chairs, a ticking wall clock. Douglas Weir stood when I entered. Early 60s calm blue eyes, a suit that fit perfectly, but not extravagantly. He extended his hand. "Miss Bennett, thank you for coming." Of course. He gestured for me to sit, then took his place behind a walnut desk. There was a leather folder in front of him, and beside it a small metal box, the color of faded denim. It looked completely unremarkable until he placed one hand on it and said, "This belonged to your grandmother." My breath hitched. She kept it in her kitchen pantry. I remember it. I always thought it held recipes. Douglas nodded. "She instructed us to safeguard this box and deliver it to you personally." Along with this letter, he lifted a cream envelope with her handwriting and a set of documents. He pushed everything toward me, then folded his hands. "Your grandmother made some rather unorthodox decisions near the end of her life. She rewrote her will twice." I glanced down at the documents. "Twice," he nodded. "The final amendment was completed 4 months before her passing. It established a private trust in your name. The trust holds liquid assets totaling $2.5 million US. It also includes her personal residence in Evanston, Illinois." I froze. "I'm sorry what she left everything to you, Claire." I blinked. "No." That can't be right. My parents said I stopped myself. Douglas looked me straight in the eye. Your parents said many things, I suspect. Mrs. Prescott Helen left clear instructions that these assets bypass your mother and father entirely. She believed you were the only one who understood what her legacy should mean. I picked up the envelope, my fingers trembled. And the box I asked. He smiled faintly. That, is personal. I haven't opened it, but your grandmother did say it might answer questions you've carried for a long time. I nodded slowly, unsure if I was breathing properly. This is overwhelming. I can imagine, he said gently. I turned the envelope over, hesitating. Did she say why me? He opened a drawer and pulled out a handwritten note on firm stationery. She didn't explain everything, but she did write this addressed to our office. Claire has always walked through the world with quiet integrity. The others wear masks. She has scars. I trust her more than any of them. Tears threatened to spill, but I held them back. He added, If you'd like, we can discuss the legal logistics later. There's no urgency, but the trust is active, and the house is yours. I glanced again at the metal box. Has anyone tried to contest the will? He nodded slightly. There have been inquiries, your mother especially. But your grandmother was precise. Every document is notarized, witnessed, and protected by both state and federal law. If they challenge, they'll lose. There was something final in his tone, something that made me feel both powerful and afraid. I took a breath. Then I guess it's time to open the box. He nodded. Take your time. I reached for the faded latch. It clicked open with a soft metallic sound, and inside, a stack of folded letters tied with blue ribbon, a small jewelry pouch, and at the very bottom, a manila envelope labeled simply Truth. I didn't open anything, not there, not yet. I closed the lid and stood gripping the box tightly. Thank you, Mr. Weir. Claire, he said gently. Your grandmother believed you'd know what to do next. I nodded. I do. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the next step. I didn't tell anyone. Not my roommate, not my professors, certainly not my parents. For the first time in years, I had something they didn't know, something they couldn't touch. I took the documents home in a plain canvas tote and spent the next several nights poring over them with a highlighter and notepad. The trust agreement was airtight. Douglas Weir hadn't been exaggerating. Every clause had been drafted with surgical precision. There were signature stamps, notarial seals from the state of Illinois. My grandmother had anticipated resistance. She'd prepared for every angle. The assets weren't just cash. There were bonds, a small portfolio of stocks, and most surprisingly, a minority stake in a private equity firm. It was buried deep in the appendix, listed under the name Prescott and Lark Holdings. At first, I skimmed past it, but something tugged at me. The name Lark rang faintly familiar. So I traced it. It took some digging, but within 2 hours at the campus library, I found what I was looking for. Prescott and Lark Holdings had once managed timberland investments and agricultural land in Missouri passed down through Helen's father, my great-grandfather. That meant the company wasn't new. It was a legacy, something long buried beneath layers of legal restructuring. I returned to the trust document and matched the equity codes. The trust held a 17% share. It wasn't controlling, but it was substantial. And then I found it my grandfather's original signature on the firm's founding papers dated 1965. His name, William Prescott, etched in flowing cursive at the bottom. Tears burned behind my eyes. They had told me my grandfather left nothing behind, that he was bad at business, that he died with debts. But here it was proof that he'd built something, that he'd left behind a foundation and Helen had kept it alive, kept it quiet, perhaps even hidden. And she'd given it to me. I leaned back in my chair, hands trembling. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about truth, legacy, and trust, something I had never received from the people who raised me. But Helen had trusted me. Still, I said nothing. Silence, I realized, was not the absence of noise, it was strategy. In a family like mine, where appearances were polished and cold, silence was survival. If I said something too soon, it could trigger a storm. I reread the letter Helen had written me. You will know what to do when the time is right. Don't light a fire in a storm. Wait and watch. Then act with both hands steady. So, I waited. I quietly scheduled a virtual consultation with a trust attorney, someone not affiliated with Weir's firm. She confirmed everything the trust was mine. The assets were real, and the structure was designed to minimize interference from anyone not explicitly named. She also warned me, be prepared. If your family learns of this, there may be more than legal pushback. There may be emotional sabotage. I nodded. I know. But I still told no one. Instead, I went about my days like usual. Studied, attended class, replied to emails, ate alone in the corner table of the library cafe. But every night before bed, I opened the blue box again, touched the ribbon around the letters, read another page from the financial statements, memorized the clauses, and practiced what it felt like to carry something powerful in silence. The calm before a current doesn't mean there's no storm. It means the wave hasn't risen yet. The box had been sitting on the edge of my desk for days, small, metallic, and silent like a secret waiting to detonate. I had already skimmed through most of the legal files and estate documents, but I hadn't yet opened the small envelope inside it, marked in my grandmother's handwriting, Claire, for when you're ready. I wasn't ready, but I opened it anyway. Inside was a key. It fit a smaller compartment at the base of the blue box, almost invisible unless you knew it was there. I turned it. The click echoed loud in my quiet apartment. And when I lifted the lid, I didn't find jewelry or old photographs. I found her handwriting, dozens of pages of it, some loose, some bound in a soft leather cover. Her journal, dated over 20 years. Her words were like a whisper from the grave. You were born with eyes too serious for a child. I knew then you'd see things others missed. Your mother, my daughter, has lived in fear of being small. She believes cruelty expands her. I failed her, but I will not fail you. I read for hours. She had written everything, memories, fears, warnings. She wrote about my parents' spending habits, their resentment, and their dangerous flirtation with financial fraud. I flipped through scanned copies of mortgage documents, some with forged signatures. Helen had annotated them with a red pen circling inconsistencies. She had been tracking them for years. And then I found the DNA results, folded, neatly sealed in a plastic sleeve. The names on the report made my stomach tighten. Claire Bennett, alleged child of Victoria Bennett. And beside it, one red word in my grandmother's handwriting, false. I stared at the result. 99 to 999% probability of biological relationship. The story they told me how I was adopted, how I wasn't theirs, how I was lucky to be taken in wasn't just a lie. It was strategic cruelty, a way to control, to devalue, to own. But I was their child, flesh and blood. Their lies had nothing to do with biology. They had everything to do with power. A scream formed in my chest, but I swallowed it. I set the documents down carefully, closed the journal, folded my hands. The old Claire might have cried, might have thrown something, or dialed the number she'd memorized since childhood. But not this Claire. This Claire had read the contracts. She had traced the equity shares. She had heard the voice of a woman who had loved her enough to leave behind a blueprint for survival. And I realized then I knew how to stay silent. I'd been trained in it since I was 5. But I didn't know how to forgive. Not yet. Because forgiveness required a reckoning. It required truth in the open. And truth I had learned was not something you gave away freely in a family like mine. You earned the right to speak it. You forced the room to listen. So I kept reading. Every journal entry. Every annotation, every scratched out line, until I could map their lies better than they could, until I was ready, because silence may have kept me safe, but the truth, The truth would make me free. The call came just after 8 p.m. on a Thursday. I was making tea watching steam curl into the quiet of my apartment when the screen lit up. Mom! I stared at it until it stopped. 30 seconds later, it rang again. This time, Dad. Then a text from an unknown number. We know about the money. Call us back. Now. I didn't respond. I sat down and sipped my tea. I thought maybe they would let it go. But that was naive. The third call came from a blocked number. This time I picked up. My father's voice came through first sharp cutting. Why didn't you tell us I waited? Let the silence weigh on him. Then I said, tell you what, don't play dumb. We know Claire, about the house, the trust, everything. You think you can just sneak around behind our backs? I breathed in slowly. You disowned me years ago. That's not the point. My mother snapped suddenly on the line too. Of course she was on speaker. You're still our daughter. We deserve to know. I paused, then answered evenly, you said I wasn't your daughter? Over and over for years. Why would I call you with good news? The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was hostile. We're entitled to part of that estate, my father said, voice low now. We raised you. We gave you everything. I laughed. Actually laughed. You gave me nothing but trauma. My mother's voice turned icy. Be careful how you speak to us. You don't want this to get ugly. Too late, I said. It already was. They hung up. 2 days later, I received a letter from a lawyer, one they'd clearly hired in haste. It was thinly veiled demands to discuss shared interest in the estate threats of contesting the will accusations that I had manipulated an elderly woman for financial gain. I didn't panic. I made an appointment with Eileen Monroe. I'd followed her work for years. She had a reputation for being merciless in court, especially when it came to family financial abuse cases. Children exploited, heirs coerced, elderly grandparents isolated by their own children for control of their assets. When I met her in person, she looked over the documents I brought, trust papers, letters, my grandmother's journal entries, the DNA result. She looked up at me and said, "You've been preparing for this your whole life, haven't you?" I nodded. They think they can drag me through court and scare me into settling. I won't let them rewrite this narrative. Eileen smiled, not warmly, but like a chess player, seeing a checkmate 10 moves ahead. Good, because we're not settling. We drafted a cease and desist letter that same day, calm, professional, and laced with sharp legal teeth. It cited the independent nature of the trust, the documented abuse, the DNA results, and clear testimony from Douglas Weir. I signed it with steady hands. And when I walked out of her office into the cold Charleston air, I didn't feel victorious. I felt clear. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. This was defense. But they had just opened a door I would now walk through prepared. Because this wasn't just about inheritance. This was about reclaiming every inch of truth they had tried to bury. And I wasn't done digging. A week after hiring Eileen Monroe, I thought the worst had passed. Then I got a call from Mrs. Halloway, Grandma Helen's next-door neighbor. We'd exchanged Christmas cards when I was little. She had soft eyes, stiff curls, and a voice like static on an old radio. "Claire, honey," she began hesitantly. "I didn't want to get involved, but I think you should know. Your parents were here." I blinked, gripping my phone tighter. "At the house. Yes, just yesterday, with a man in a navy suit. Said he was a realtor. I overheard your mother saying something about selling it quickly to someone they know. Something about keeping it in the circle." What I asked, my voice suddenly sharp. "I thought the house was yours," she said softly. "Helen was always so proud of what she arranged for you." I thanked her, barely got the words out before ending the call. Then I drove, 3 hours straight shot. I didn't even stop for coffee. When I reached Grandma's house, it looked the same. White shutters, faded lilac bushes, wine chimes clinking. But there was a for sale sign jammed into the lawn. A laminated brochure hung below it. I tore it off. It listed the home as a fixer-upper priced far below market value. Cash offers preferred. Closing in 10 days. I stood there frozen. Then I took a photo, got back in my car, and called Eileen. They're trying to sell my grandmother's house. Illegally, they're not on the deed, but they're acting like they are. Then we'll stop it. The next 48 hours blurred. Eileen filed for a temporary restraining order on the property sale. She contacted Douglas Weir, who verified the deed's transfer into my name through the trust. The transaction had been completed and registered properly weeks before. She then drafted a notice of interest and had it recorded with the county. That alone would stall any legitimate sale attempt. But just to be sure, we also filed an injunctive relief motion to prevent any activity on the title until the trust dispute was resolved, if my parents actually dared to pursue it. In parallel, Eileen wrote a strongly worded letter to the listing agent, attaching all relevant legal documents. The message was clear: you are facilitating fraudulent activity. Cease immediately or face litigation. 2 days later, the for sale sign vanished. The realtor never responded, but I heard from Mrs. Halloway again. Claire, I don't know what you did, but your parents showed up this morning and looked furious. Your mother threw the brochure into the storm drain. I didn't smile. There was nothing satisfying about it yet, because I could feel what was coming next: escalation. They'd tried to sell something that didn't belong to them. Now that they'd failed quietly, I knew they'd lash out loudly. But I also knew this: they were amateurs pretending to be predators. I had evidence, law, and time on my side. And every document they forged, every shady phone call they made, it was all becoming part of a story they couldn't control anymore. A story I was finally writing. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just reacting to what they did. I was responding with precision. I wasn't backing down. I was anchoring in. Eileen called me on a rainy Thursday, the kind of day where thunder made the windows tremble. Her voice was calm but firm, like she was about to hand me a scalpel instead of a cigarette. Claire, she said, we found something. She and her team had been combing through county records, tracing any past financial entanglements tied to the family. Not just mine, not just Grandma Helen's trust, everything. What they found was a loan agreement filed 3 years ago, a $180,000 credit line, signed under the name Helen M. Whitmore. Only it wasn't her signature. Douglas Weir confirmed it twice, even sent us an old driver's license of Helen's for comparison. The difference was obvious. The real Helen had a steady, elegant slant in her handwriting, a quirk in her uppercase W. The signature on the loan was sharp, rushed, and masculine. The borrower, Charles L. Bennett, my father. He'd listed himself as co-applicant, but he had signed the primary authorization on Helen's behalf. No power of attorney, no legal authority, no permission, pure forgery. I stared at the PDF Eileen sent over. The thought came with a rush of nausea. He used her. He used my grandmother's name, her credit history, her clean financial legacy without her knowledge to secure money that likely went to patch whatever bleeding hole he and my mother had made in their private accounts. The bank should have verified the signature, I said. They probably didn't care, Eileen replied. Or Charles convinced them it was legit. People like your father, they know how to sound credible in suits. Is this criminal? Yes, forgery, bank fraud, and elder abuse depending on the DA's appetite. That last word, abuse, landed harder than I expected. It made sense. Just like my childhood made sense in hindsight. It wasn't just dysfunction or cold parenting. It was systemic erosion of trust, legality, and dignity. They didn't just ignore me. They exploited Helen. It explained the hushed conversations, the financial mysteries, the sudden desperation to reclaim Grandma's house. They weren't just greedy. They were terrified, because if I looked too closely, I'd find this. And now I had. Eileen asked if I wanted to press criminal charges. I didn't answer immediately. I needed to sit with the question. Not out of fear, but out of clarity. Because pressing charges meant fire, headlines. The truth spilled wide. It also meant justice, maybe even accountability. But it would come at a cost, publicly and emotionally. Let me think, I finally said. but prepare everything, just in case. Already have Eileen replied. I've also sent a preservation notice to the bank requesting all internal communications about that loan. Of course she had. As I sat in my apartment, rain sliding down the windows like slow tears, I remembered something Helen used to say, "Don't shout to be heard. Just open the window. Let the wind carry the truth." That wind was building. And Charles. He had no idea a storm was already moving in. The call came just after dinner. I almost didn't answer. It was Aunt Susan, my mother's younger sister. The nice one if there ever was one. She had a soft spot for vintage teacups and once sent me postcards from Portugal when I was 10. We hadn't spoken in years. "Claire," she said, cautious. "Hi, Aunt Susan." A pause. "Then I need to ask something, and I hope you'll be honest." I sat down. "Is it true you're trying to claim all of Helen's estate for yourself?" The words weren't hers. I could hear it. That phrasing belonged to my mother. Claim, all, for yourself. As if I'd walked into Helen's house with a crowbar and a will forged in crayon. "No," I said carefully. "I'm following what Grandma put in writing. It's all legal. She made the trust, not me. But why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because no one treated me like part of the family, until there was money involved." Another pause. Deeper this time. "Your mother's been saying things she admitted. That you manipulated Helen. That you planned this. I didn't even know about the trust until after Helen died." "I know. I want to believe that. But she didn't say she did, just that she wanted to." It stung. "You don't have to pick a side," I told her. "I think I already have just by calling you." That stayed with me. By Friday, 2 cousins had unfollowed me on social media. My Uncle Ray sent a cryptic email about keeping things in the family. And a distant relative I hadn't heard from in a decade messaged me asking if I really had $2.5 million. The money had become a mirror. It didn't change people, it revealed them. Lines were being drawn, but I wasn't the one with the chalk. All I did was hold up what was already written. Grandma Helen chose me, not because I asked, but because she knew. And some people couldn't stand that. The courtroom was colder than I expected. Not physically, though the air conditioning did hum a little too loud, but emotionally. There was no warmth in the way people looked at each other, no kindness in the glances exchanged, just hard stares and furrowed brows. Margot sat 2 rows behind the plaintiff's table spine, rigid, dressed in navy blue like she was mourning something. Maybe her image, maybe control. Charles was next to her, hands clasped tightly in his lap, face blank but twitchy around the eyes. He wouldn't look at me. My lawyer, Eileen Monroe, had her files organized into color-coded tabs labeled in a handwriting so precise it could pass for type. She defended victims of financial abuse for over a decade. She knew when to be silent, when to interrupt, and when to let a person hang themselves with their own words. That was our strategy with Margot. The judge called the hearing to order, and the attorneys opened with formalities. Then Margot took the stand. Her lawyer guided her gently through her testimony. She painted herself as a grieving daughter, blindsided by a manipulative granddaughter who'd taken advantage of an old woman's confusion. "And then she's not even my daughter," Margot said, suddenly, the words cutting the air like a blade. Gasps, whispers. A pause so thick it smothered the room. My hands stayed still in my lap. I didn't flinch. Eileen stood slowly. "Your Honor, we'd like to present evidence rebutting that claim." The judge nodded. I walked forward. "This," I said, holding up the blue metal box, "was found among my grandmother's personal belongings. It contains a notarized letter, a certified DNA report, and multiple affidavits." I placed the items on the evidence table one by one. The DNA test was requested not by me, but by Margot herself when I was 12. It proves with over 99.9% certainty that I am her biological daughter. The letter, handwritten by my grandmother, describes how Margot tried to take control of the trust, claiming I wasn't family. When that failed, she began alienating me from both my grandmother and the family estate. I looked directly at Margot. You told me for years I didn't belong, that I was adopted, that I wasn't worthy of love, let alone a place in this family. I picked up the last document. This is a rejected power of attorney form submitted by Margot attempting to transfer full control of Helen's assets to herself. My grandmother refused to sign. Margot's face had gone pale. Charles looked like he wanted to disappear. The courtroom was silent. I continued. For over a decade, I believed I was nothing more than a mistake someone agreed to raise out of pity. I believed I wasn't smart enough, strong enough, or good enough. But I was wrong. What my grandmother gave me wasn't just money. It was validation. A quiet, final word after a lifetime of silence. The judge leaned forward, studying the documents. The attorneys began conferring. There would be more legal steps, of course. But the room had shifted. The truth had landed. Margot didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead, lips pressed thin. And me. I breathed. For the first time in years, I let air reach the deepest corners of my lungs. That blue box, weathered, dented, barely locked, had held my entire life inside it. Not just inheritance, but identity, memory, proof. In the end, it wasn't just about money. It was about finally being able to say I was here. I mattered, and I am not who you said I was. Just when I thought the room couldn't get heavier, the side door creaked open. Heads turned. Murmurs stirred. A woman, hunched but composed, entered with a quiet steadiness that made the air hold its breath. Her silver hair was swept neatly into a bun. Her eyes, sharp observant, scanned the room before settling on me. Mildred Connolly, my grandmother's oldest friend. I hadn't seen her since the memorial I wasn't invited to. She walked toward the witness stand slowly, her cane tapping lightly against the linoleum. The court officer helped her up the steps, and she adjusted the microphone with surprising steadiness for someone her age. Eileen stood, her voice calm but firm. Your Honor, we call Mildred Connolly as a character and fact witness on behalf of Claire Bennett. Margot's lawyer objected. She wasn't disclosed during pretrial. We received confirmation of her willingness to testify this morning, Eileen replied smoothly. Overruled, the judge said. Continue. I sat motionless, hands clenched under the table. Eileen approached the stand. Mrs. Connolly, how long did you know the late Mrs. Helen Fairchild, 63 years, Mildred said without hesitation. Since we were 17. Did she ever speak to you about her relationship with Claire Bennett? Constantly, she said, looking at me with a kind smile. She loved Claire deeply. Said she was the only one who ever listened, who ever asked what she needed, not just what they could take. A flicker passed over Margot's face. Eileen nodded. Were you present for any conversations or incidents involving Helen Fairchild's legal documents? Mildred's face sobered. Yes, I was there the day Margot tried to get Helen to sign over full control of her assets. Eileen's tone sharpened. What do you mean by tried to get her? Margot brought a power of attorney form. Helen was already weak, recovering from a medication change. She had no business making decisions in that state. The courtroom was still. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. I asked Margot to stop. I told her Helen wasn't lucid. She told me to mind my own business and sent me out of the room. I didn't leave. I stood just outside the doorway. I heard Helen ask what she was signing. I heard Margot say, just a bank thing, nothing important. And then I watched her guide Helen's hand onto the line. My breath caught in my chest. Eileen walked to the evidence table. Mrs. Connolly, is this the document you witnessed that day? She adjusted her glasses and examined the paper. That's the one. Eileen turned to the judge. Your Honor, we contend this document was signed under duress with a witness who objected and by a grantor who was medically compromised. We request it be stricken from consideration. Margot was no longer composed. Her jaw clenched, her arms crossed. Then Mildred turned to me. Helen knew you'd be alone when this happened, she said quietly, loud enough for the court to hear. That's why she wrote everything down. That's why she gave you that box. She trusted you. She always did. I looked at her, unable to speak. A lump had formed in my throat. For the first time, I wasn't the one defending myself. Someone else was standing up not just for the truth, but for me. Mildred leaned back in the chair. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't tense anymore. It was reverent. The courtroom had fallen into a tense quiet after Mildred's testimony. Even Margot seemed stunned into silence, her eyes darting between the blue box and the now disputed documents. But I could feel it before it happened. The way my father shifted in his seat, fidgeting, cracking his knuckles. It was the same tension I remembered from my childhood, the same tremor in the air before something was said that couldn't be taken back. Then he stood up. Charles Bennett, former finance manager, father by blood but not by bond, was done sitting quietly. He pointed at me, voice louder than it had any right to be in a court of law. "This is ridiculous. We are her parents." Her parents. His lawyer tugged gently at his sleeve, whispering something, but Charles yanked his arm away. "She wouldn't have anything if it weren't for us. We raised her, paid for everything until she turned 18. And this is how she repays us." He turned to the judge now, his face flushed red. She was adopted out of pity. And now she's claiming she deserves millions from my wife's mother. "Come on." I didn't react. I just kept my eyes on the judge, who now wore an expression I couldn't quite read, but it was no longer neutral. Charles wasn't done. We are her legal parents. That house, that money, it should be ours by default. She should know better. She should be grateful. That word grateful rang through the courtroom like an insult. And somehow it was. Judge Avery held up his hand. "Mr. Bennett, please sit down." But my father shook his head, still standing. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is not just about law. It's about family. She is betraying her own parents." And then came the line that changed everything. "She needs to be controlled. If she'd just listened, none of this would have happened." The air snapped. There it was, the truth raw and bare, laid out for everyone to hear. Not love, not protection. Control. The court stenographer's fingers didn't miss a beat. Every word captured, preserved. Judge Avery's expression sharpened. He scribbled something in his notes, then looked up. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. That will be enough." Charles's lawyer finally pulled him back into his seat, whispering furiously. But the damage was done. Eileen leaned over and whispered, "That just buried their case." I nodded, swallowing hard. For years, my father's voice had meant fear. It had meant decisions made for me, over me, around me. Now, in a room built on justice, it had finally betrayed him. Outside, the storm they'd brought to my door was beginning to turn. Inside, I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. But I did breathe. Fully, freely, for the first time in years. It was the quiet after the storm that unsettled me most. No more hearings, no more legal motions, no more blue boxes waiting to be opened. Just silence. A silence that wasn't peaceful. It echoed around me like an unanswered question. I was standing in the kitchen of my grandmother's house, my house now, when the phone rang. I recognized the number before it lit up fully on the screen. "Margot." I let it ring once, twice. I thought about not answering, but something in me needed to hear what she would say, not for closure, but for clarity. I answered without a greeting. There was a pause before she spoke. Her voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "Claire," I just wanted to say. Maybe I was wrong. I said nothing. I didn't trust whatever came next. I mean about how things happened. Your grandmother, she always thought you were special. Maybe I just didn't see it. Another pause. "Can we try again?" As a family, I closed my eyes. The word family felt misplaced coming from her lips. I kept my voice steady. Is this about a relationship or about a percentage of longer silence? I could hear the faint creak of her chair, a breath, maybe even tears being held back. But there was no answer, not even a whisper. That was my answer. I didn't hang up in anger. I simply ended the call. Sometimes the silence between words tells you everything. The news spread faster than I could control. By the following week, the local paper had printed the headline, "Young Woman Wins Case Against Biological Mother. Hidden Trust Fund Uncovered." The article included a picture of me leaving the courthouse looking stoic, probably more exhausted than victorious. I hadn't given any statement, but that didn't stop others from speaking for me. Cousin Teresa messaged me on Facebook, "I support you, Claire. You did what no one else had the courage to do." But 5 minutes later, I saw Aunt Linda's post not tagging me, but leaving no doubt. Some people forget who raised them when money's on the table. The family split like dry wood. On one side were those who had suspected for years that Margot and Charles were overbearing. On the other were the ones who said I was being dramatic, ungrateful, a gold digger with a law degree. I tried not to read the comments under the online articles, but of course I did. Entitled "Brat." Good for her. Financial abuse is real. No one sues their parents unless they want attention. I read them all, the ugly ones and the kind ones. I didn't reply. Then came the blog posts, think pieces. One of them called me a symbol of quiet resistance, a phrase that made my breath catch. Maybe that's what this was all along. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't made a scene. I just collected the evidence, waited, and used the truth. I never imagined I'd become a mirror for other people's projections, hope for some disappointment for others. At the grocery store, someone whispered as I passed. Another person smiled and nodded. A barista gave me a free coffee and said, "Good on you for standing your ground." But when I visited my grandmother's church just once, an older woman who used to pinch my cheeks growing up looked through me like I wasn't there. The reactions weren't good or bad. They were simply revealing. I hadn't just won a court case. I'd exposed something that made people uncomfortable, that sometimes it's not outsiders who hurt us most. Sometimes it's the ones who claim to love us most loudly who do the deepest damage. And when you call that out, when you stop playing the role they wrote for you, you don't just lose their approval, you lose the illusion. But in its place, you gain something real. The first morning back in my grandmother's house was nothing like I remembered, and yet in the smallest ways, it was exactly the same. There was no scent of cinnamon waffles drifting from the kitchen, no hum of her favorite jazz record spinning in the background, but the light still spilled through the sheer curtains in the exact way it had when I was 8 years old, legs swinging from a bar stool as she flipped pancakes and hummed off key. I moved slowly through the house, not out of fear, just reverence. The air was still as if the walls were waiting to exhale. I stood in the living room for a long time, letting the morning light settle on my face. And then, with hands that didn't shake, I pulled the blue box from my bag and placed it on the bookshelf just beneath the framed photo of us. It was a photo taken during one of those Saturday mornings when the world felt simple. I was 8. She was teaching me how to braid lavender into ribbons. Her face was creased in laughter, mine wide-eyed with concentration. It had been tucked behind legal documents, and now it belonged where it could be seen. The house had become quiet in her absence, but not empty. As I unpacked a few boxes and set them in familiar corners, I realized I wasn't trying to recreate what had been. I was honoring it by building something new on the foundation she left behind. This wasn't just my inheritance. It was my beginning. The settlement left me with more money than I had ever expected to manage. It would have been tempting even to disappear into a quiet life. A few vacations, pay off the mortgage, build walls and keep people out. But that wasn't what she raised me for. So I used 30% of the estate to establish something bigger than myself. I called it the Blue Box Initiative. It began with one idea that financial abuse within families is real and often invisible. I had lived it, and I had the tools to fight it, but most don't. Most are trapped by shame silence or legal systems that favor the louder voices with deeper pockets. The Blue Box Initiative provides legal support and financial counseling to individuals, particularly women who are navigating financial manipulation and coercion within their families. We partnered with attorneys like Eileen Monroe, with therapists, with financial literacy programs. We also launched a scholarship arm 5 law students every year, selected not just for their grades, but for their grit. Priority went to first-generation college students, young women who reminded me of myself. In our first year, we helped 17 clients secure restraining orders against financially abusive relatives. 8 received emergency housing support. 2 regained control over stolen retirement funds. One called me personally and said, "Your foundation saved my life." That's when I knew. The Blue Box hadn't just been a vessel of secrets. It had become a symbol of something else: resilience, truth, and the quiet strength of saying, "This ends with me." There had been one letter left. I hadn't touched it for weeks. It remained sealed in the bottom of the blue box, its envelope yellowed, and edges curling ever so slightly. In her handwriting, elegant, stubborn, was my name, Claire. I opened it slowly, sitting cross-legged in the same chair where she once read me bedtime stories. My dearest Claire, if you're reading this, it means I'm no longer there to hand you my truths in person. But some truths you must hold in your own hands. I know the things I've kept from you, and I know you may struggle to forgive me for them. But I ask you not to carry anger. Carry clarity. You were never anyone's secret. You were my choice. You were my legacy. You saw the truth when others looked away. You held your ground when it would have been easier to fold. That strength is rare. Guard it well. If family was only biology, I wouldn't have chosen you. Family, real family, is where no one lives in fear of telling the truth. If you can build a place like that for even one other soul, then my legacy is complete. Love always, Grandma H. I didn't cry. Not because it didn't move me, but because her words didn't break me. They rebuilt me, word by word, line by line. I placed the letter back in the box and slid it shut gently. Like closing a chapter I was finally ready to honor. Outside, the sky was that gentle blue she loved, somewhere between dusk and promise. The kind of blue that asks nothing, says everything. Before we say goodbye, I just want to ask, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. I read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.